Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to finally finish this configuration and we're going to spin up our SSH server. So, okay, let's save this file. Remember that you are under the CentOS 7 folder that we created. So let's go back to the Jenkins data folder where we have our Docker compose file, and let's modify this Docker compose file. Okay, so we already defined the Docker file that we're going to use to build the image. Now it's time to define the service like this one, but for our remote host. So cool. Remember that we're going to create another service, so we should start on this level. So let's hit enter and we go 2 spaces and we're in this level. Nice. So we're going to create a new service, which is going to be remote host. Pretty simple. And then we're going to define properties like this. So in this case, we're going to set the container name for this service as the remote host. So we're going to say that this container is going to be called remote host. Cool. Now we're going to specify the image. As you see here we were downloading an image from Docker Hub. But now we're going to create our own image using the Docker file that we created. So we can give it the name that we want because we're going to create that image. So let's call it like remote host. Cool. But as the image doesn't exist, we need to specify a parameter, which is a build parameter, and then we need to specify a context. So the context means where is located the Docker file. So if you remember, from here, our Docker file is located under the CentOS 7. So if we do cat CentOS 7 Docker file, we're going to have here the Docker file that we created. So it means that the Docker file is under the CentOS 7 folder. So let's go to our Docker compose file and let's say that the context is CentOS 7. Remember that that is the folder where Docker is going to go and look for the Docker file. And the last thing that we need to do is that remember that in here we created a network. So we need to include this new service in this network to allow communication between this service and this service. So we're going to do exactly the same thing, networks, and then we define here the network net. Pretty nice. So cool. Here with this piece of code, we're defining our service, which is going to be remote host, a container name, the image that we're going to build, and the network where the container is going to live. So okay, let's save this. Oops. Okay. And now to make our image real, we need to do a Docker compose build. So what's going to happen when we hit enter? If you take a look on your Docker compose file, we're saying that the build context is under the CentOS 7 folder that we created. So whenever we hit Docker compose build, this instruction is going to be executed. Docker is going to go into this directory and it's going to look for a file called Docker file and it's going to execute everything that we defined there. So let's go and do the Docker compose build, hit enter. And the first thing that you are going to do is that remember this step that says from CentOS. I told you that this is an official image and this is going to be exactly the same way as it happened to the Jenkins image. Remember that we didn't have the Jenkins image, that we did a Docker pull and we had a screen like this. So in this case, Docker is doing exactly the same, is pulling the CentOS image to take it as a base, and then after the download finishes, it's going to start building the instruction that we provided before. So cool, as you can see here, the pull already completed. And now Docker is going to start executing these instructions, which actually install the server, configure the user, and more. So this actually may take a while. Don't worry, I will pause the video and I'll see you once it has finished. So cool, as you can see here, the build process already finished and we have everything installed. As you can see, all the steps that we define in here and in here were executed correctly. And now we have our image, which is called remote host, build. So if we take a look to our Docker Compose file and we look into this value image remote host, this is the image that we actually built. So now if you do a Docker image, you're going to find out the image that you created 30 seconds ago and the CentOS image that was downloaded in order to take that image as a base. Remember that we defined that in the Docker file in the from. So that's cool. So you already have your image which has an SSH service installed. Nice. So the only one thing that you need to do is to create a container based on that. But we don't have any containers regarding to that image. And why? So remember that to create the services, we need to do a docker compose app-d, and that is going to first read all the content of this file, and then is going to create the things that are left. In this case, our remote host. So cool. If we do a docker ps now, you are going to see here your container up and running, which is pretty cool. So let's go ahead into the Jenkins container. And from here, we are going to SSH the remote user at remote host. If you hit enter, you are going to see that this is prompting for check-in. So you say yes, and then you give the password, which is 1234. Pretty nice. And as you can see, you are logged in into the other container from Jenkins. So this is pretty nice. Let me exit out of all of these container. If I do docker ps, you are going to see that I'm outside of the container. If you take a look on the Docker Compose file, this name is Jenkins and this name is remote host. It means that if I go inside of Jenkins, I can see this remote host using this name. So this is something like the DNS, an internal DNS for Docker. So the names that we define here, we can use those names to connect, to ping, or to do whatever we want. And remember that this remote host service is using the CentOS 7 Docker file that we created, and here we created a remote user for connections. So again, if I go inside of the Jenkins container and I do an SSH using the user that we created, and then we say at the host or the IP of this guy, in this case this is the DNS, we are going to be able to connect. Cool. So we just give the password and we are connected as the remote user in the remote container. You can even ping that container, and you are going to see that this name resolves and gives you an answer. So this is pretty cool. Now, the only one thing that we need to do is to test the connection using the key file that we created. So if you go into the CentOS 7 directory, remember about these files? This is the poop file that we copied to the image, and this is the private file that we created. So if we copy this file, for example, docker cp this file to the Jenkins container into /temp/ the same name, if you now go inside of the Jenkins container, and then you browse to that directory, you are going to see the key that we copied. Cool. And now you can use this key to connect to that remote user at remote host. But remember, when you pass -i, you need to define the name of the key file. So this is the key file. We copy paste. So we are saying, hey, please SSH. Use this remote key to connect to the remote user at this remote host. And what's going to happen here is that now SSH is not going to ask you for a password because you are already getting authenticated using this key, which is pretty cool. So this is why we created this key to allow connections without a password. So if you see, if I remove this I from here, it's going to prompt me for a password. But if I pass the -i options and then I pass the key that we generated before, remember, not the poof, but the private, then it's going to log in without any password. It's going to be authenticated using this remote key, which is pretty cool. This is awesome. You already have two containers up and running, one Jenkins container and one remote host. So from now on, you are going to be connecting from Jenkins to this remote host as we saw before. So this is it for this video. I'll see you in the next lesson.